Thank you for joining us for this discussion about migration from Microsoft Team Foundation Server to Azure DevOps services. I'm joined today by two members of Grey Matter's services team, Mark Trippier.
Hi.
Hi, and James Mail.
Hello.
Hi, James. And we're going to be looking at how teams can migrate to Azure DevOps. We'll be looking at some of the challenges that can arise and the services that we've put together here at Grey Matter to deal with these. Grey Matter has been serving the developer community since 1983, and as Microsoft's primary Visual Studio reseller, we're in a pretty good place to assess the progress being made by customers in adopting DevOps. This is on the radar for many IT departments that haven't already transitioned to this way of working. And I wouldn't mind betting that DevOps crops up during most monthly departmental meetings. Mark and James, you were both at Microsoft's developer event, Ignite, earlier this year. I think that was back in January. That seems a long time ago now. But what did you take away from this event as far as migration to DevOps is concerned? Were you able to form a view on this?
Yes, we were at the Ignite exhibition in London in January. It says Microsoft's annual conference for developers and IT professionals, hosted by Microsoft to showcase the latest in development products and techniques. We attended a keynote presentation all around CI/CD, and there was approximately 500 attendees. And one of the first questions was, please raise your hands if you're currently using TFS. And approximately 80% of the attendees put up their hand, which was obviously why they were there to view the presentation. And the second question was interesting, which was how many of you are planning to move to DevOps within the next year? And again, about 80% of those put their hands up, stating that they were planning on a migration. And the third question, which is really what helped us decide we needed to help people, was how many of you are unsure how to move from TFS to Azure DevOps? And at least 70% of them raised their hands, which is why we've looked into how we can assist with this.
Gosh, that's quite a large number of attendees then, and it doesn't surprise me to some extent, because we know that this isn't necessarily an easy transition, and we'll look at the detail behind that shortly. So it sounds like Azure DevOps, for a variety of reasons, is where most Visual Studio-based developer teams want to end up. As we'll see shortly, the migration path won't be the same for everyone. It depends on a number of things, such as the amount of code that needs to be brought across, but also how current or far back you are with your release of TFS. I'll let Mark and James say a little bit more about this shortly. First, though, it might be useful to look at how we arrived at where we are today with Microsoft's ALM tools. Azure DevOps currently exists in two forms at the present time. The on-premises deployment is Azure DevOps Server, and the cloud implementation is Azure DevOps Services. So server is on-premises, services is cloud. This slide illustrates the evolution of the ALM tools, although I'm not going to dwell on this at the moment. We'll learn more in a moment about how this affects migration when we come to that point in the discussion shortly. So just very briefly, ALM tools or awareness started to really take hold with the release of Microsoft Visual Studio.net back in 2002. And by 2005, quite a number of the components that evolved into the tools that we're using today began to feature in what was called Visual Studio Team Systems. However, the collaboration piece, the Team Foundation server, took another year or so to appear. That was in 2006, and the current database that underpinned that was, of course, SQL Server 2005. And although there's been a number of iterations, it wasn't until 2010 that we saw a really big uptake with Team Foundation Server. We were dealing with a lot of inquiries from our customer base who were really beginning to invest in the full collaboration suite, including the server. And shortly after that, the cloud became a feature. And that's when some of this was ported over to the cloud. That was Visual Studio Online, renamed Team Services in 2015, and renamed again as Azure DevOps Services in 2018. The on-premises Team Foundation server didn't become renamed until 2019. That's when Azure DevOps Server was branded. And all this is quite relevant in a moment when we will look at this in more detail. So while Microsoft recognizes a need for both on-premises server deployment and a cloud-based services solution, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the main benefits of managing the application lifecycle in the Azure cloud.
Well, where there's certainly some organizations that will definitely benefit from having their DevOps on site or on-prem, such as probably MI6 and GCHQ. For the majority of us, moving it up into the cloud definitely brings benefits. If we start with hardware, just the purchase cost, the maintenance and the replacement of hardware. If we look at software, you've got to license it, patch it, upgrade it, and that's not just at TFS level. You've also got to do it at OS level that your TF server is sitting on. So the best thing about moving it up into the cloud is obviously the higher resilience, because that will enable you to be more productive with your dev team, and it'll provide 24/7 connectivity for them to work on. Microsoft actually guarantees as a standard the 3 nines for DevOps, which is actually only 8.76 hours of perceived downtime per year. By doing replication across different availability areas, you can get that as high as 5 nines, which is only 5.26 minutes of downtime. And Microsoft are so confident about their service and that it'll be up, that they offer service credits if these terms aren't met. So it enables you to tie your services against the Microsoft SLAs, which is very beneficial.
Yeah, sure. So it sounds to me like this is very much about availability. Is scalability a factor in this, Mark or James?
Well, usually for most dev teams, just one instance of DevOps is all you really need. Very few companies have enough developers to swamp it or enough projects to swamp it. The only time you'd really be looking at the benefits of high availability for it is where you're connecting on to web apps, web functions, or scalable databases.
The way I always like to put it as well as like the main benefits are when you're looking at your company resources, you're keeping that money in your pocket as opposed to paying out for those new servers. And then the concentration of your developers and IT team can be concentrating on, you know, what it makes you a business and concentrating on that development rather than being concerned with the upkeep of your servers and that sort of thing. And by nature, it being in the cloud makes it accessible by anywhere. So if you're a global company, you don't have to worry about your particular network or that sort of thing. If somebody getting back into your system, you can have people in every country of the world accessing your development area.
Yeah, and I guess it's also about speed of delivery too, because if you've got to provision new hardware just simply for a test for building and testing a new application, that's all time delay as well, isn't it? So yeah,
Certainly.
I can see there's lots of benefits, and I think that's pretty well recognized, isn't it, now that the cloud is a very suitable location for your development work. So let's talk now about migrating TFS projects over to Azure. I'd like to know, are there any caveats or gotchas with this?
There's potentially a few, but the main one to consider is the only supported migration path by Microsoft is that your TFS server has to be up to 2019 prior to migration.
Okay, so an up-to-date migration from your perspective is 2019 onwards.
It is. That's the only one that's supported at the moment, although they are just in the process of releasing 2020, which at the moment's in RC1, and it will show on the upgrade path slide that I show in a moment. But it's not really being used in production yet. It is purely RC1.
Yeah. So given a relatively up-to-date set of projects, what does a lift and shift look like? What is it like? What's likely to be involved, and how can Grey Matter's TFS migration services assist with this?
The typical upgrade path, most of the clients that we speak to seem to be on 2013 and above, which makes the upgrade process slightly simpler. If you're on 2013, you've got 2 hops to get to 2019. If you're on 2015, you can get there directly, as can be seen from the image up above. However, if you're back as far as 2005, there's several steps you have to take, but as not many of us are on 2005 these days, I'll skip that part. Essentially, when we're doing an upgrade, the things to consider are, as they've increased the sort of ability of what DevOps can do, so included in over the years things like boards and test plans, etc. They've also had to update the database to accommodate how things work. And essentially what they've done is try and bring TFS in line with Azure DevOps in the cloud so that it does become an easy migration. So a lot of the changes at this level before we look at your code are simple things like where they've changed field names in the database, where they've changed structures, where they've changed protocols and things that are being called. So as part of the upgrade, we would be looking at what needs changing in your database to facilitate the upgrade prior to upgrading. A typical process for us and where we can help is typically what we'd look at is to receive a backup copy of your TFS environment. We'd create an environment at our end that matches your version. We then do the tests to see that it can be upgraded to 2019 and what things might break or need to be changed as a result. We'd make any changes needed to the TFS environment and recommend any changes needed to yourselves for the actual code side of your projects. The other thing that needs to be taken into consideration is you need to have an AD environment in the cloud, so Azure Active Directory, and that needs to be synchronized with your on-prem Active Directory so that all your users that you're currently using inside TFS can be seen, and the history, etc., in Azure DevOps. I know James has come across a few issues about that he might be able to share with us.
So from a few of my customers that I've spoken to, they'd first picked up DevOps when it had moved across from Visual Studio Team System. But back when it was first created, you weren't actually able to integrate your Azure AD system, and therefore you weren't using the same accounts that you would have on your on-premise environment, and that creates quite a bit of confusion around who's doing the work in DevOps and the access levels that those individuals would have within there. We can assist you in making sure that that is all streamlined so that you have got the correct accounts reflecting within DevOps, and with that also carry across the history of your projects. Where they might have been carried out on other accounts, we can make sure a like-for-like swap is done so that all that history is retained.
Yeah, it's all about continuity, isn't it, James? And minimising disruption, which is the aim of the expertise that we can bring to that.
No, exactly. And then after we've got to that stage, Graham, the next stage is obviously to do a migration to Azure DevOps from the 2009 server that we've created in our test environment. and then do all the tests on the code, users, connectivity, the history, the comments, make sure everything's there. And it's only at that point, and we've scripted everything along the way so that we can recreate it, we can then advise the client we're ready to do a migration for them, and then essentially book with them when they want to do a code freeze so that we can do the switch over of the live environment. And again, we'll do that from a backup so that if at any point they decide they want to revert back to their TFS, it hasn't done anything to their on-prem TFS solution.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, look, thanks for going through that sort of relatively simple migration from a relatively up-to-date set of projects. Let's now consider some of the older legacy projects, possibly involving a large code base with all the issues that that's likely to entail. You know, the usual sort of things that crop up: complexity, poor documentation, skills deficits, and of course the disruption and risk that goes with all migrations. I mean, it's not surprising some teams have had this on their radar for a long time, but actually haven't moved forward yet. So I think for a moment, could we just take a look at some of the things that are particularly troublesome when we're talking specifically about migrating legacy code and projects?
So if you're using legacy languages like VB6, this is going to be a great opportunity for you to upgrade into a newer language like VB.NET, C# or Java, as this is going to really help ensure that your applications are modernized. With that, you're going to get a huge range of benefits because there's certain tools and applications that just aren't going to be available to you if you're using those older legacy languages. So as you can see, fortunately, DevOps is very diverse in the number of third-party applications that you can have working alongside it. And this is, of course, by design so that you can have your CI/CD solution delivered by any means that you see fit.
Even though I presume, obviously, most of this can be done inside DevOps on its own.
It certainly can, yeah. But when we're working with legacy applications, you know, things that have been around for a very long time, it might be that, you know, the Jenkins or Octopus, for instance, is such an integral part of your application and your deployment that it's something that you want to retain, and that is fully compatible with the DevOps environment that we can help you build.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me that as with other migration projects, really, there might be a case for modernizing the code first before attempting a migration.
Exactly. Following on from James's comments about upgrading the code to a more modern version, the real benefits you have there is, rather than simply hosting your, let's say, web app in an IIS environment on a virtual machine, you can actually start considering moving it into Azure Web Apps, Azure Web Functions. These enable you to reduce the cost of actually hosting that application. It enables you to scale it with either the number of users that are currently hitting it, or the amount of processor that it's using, or the amount of memory. And it just enables you to scale out as needed in a more cost efficient manner than you could possibly do on-prem. So updating the code to be more modern is definitely a better way of doing it. And you can then also start benefiting from things like Azure DB pools. So your elastic databases enable you to, again, scale the back-end data that feeds your applications, but all, again, based on modernizing your code.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for explaining that. So to round things off then, let's assume we've now taken our customer into the cloud for their future development needs. What do you see as some of the more general benefits going forward for Microsoft development teams that have successfully moved across to Azure DevOps services?
Personally, I think there's boundless opportunities for them. I think it'll help simplify their code because the calls to databases, the calls to other applications that they embed with their web-based applications or desktop-based applications that they're developing are a lot easier to call. But also they get access to other services available in the cloud, such as Azure Logging Analyzer, cognitive services, visualization, business intelligence, machine learning, big data. And essentially that means as you continue to develop your product and your projects, you will find that you'll actually be able to enrich the experience that you're offering your users and make your product a lot better as a result.
Yeah, sure. And Grey Matter is also providing services to around cognitive services. We're doing stuff with mapping. So this is all part of the bigger picture of modernizing systems, and it's all part of why teams need to move forward with DevOps, isn't it?
Most certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks both. That was a very informative conversation about Grey Matter's services that we can provide to help people migrate to Azure DevOps. We will be hosting a webinar on the 25th of August. This will be a more in-depth exploration of the migration services we can provide. So please join us for that. In the meantime, if you have a need to discuss any of this with your account manager, please contact us using the following details.